Yeah, that's great. Wants to filter. No problem. And they are live. Yes, can you hear us okay at the back? So my name's Kate Orkin. I'm a senior research fellow in behavioral economics at the Blavatnik School of Government. It's a great pleasure to welcome Isobel Coleman today to the Blavatnik School and to talk to all of us for a discussion on what role big cash can play in policy. So it's great both because it's wonderful to have her at the school and because a big team at the school have now been working with GiveDirectly for a number of years on a large randomized control trial in Western Kenya. So it's wonderful to be able to welcome one of our partners in developing evidence for public policy to the school. So just by way of a very brief introduction, Isobel has had an amazing life. So she is currently the Chief Operating Officer at GiveDirectly. I'm sure as many of you know, this is a New York-based not-for-profit that helps families living in extreme poverty by making unconditional lump sum, fairly large cash transfers by mobile phone. But before that, Isobel also served during the second term of the Obama administration as a US representative to the UN, was previously a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a partner with McKinsey & Company. So the lady wears sneakers because she fits a fair amount in, I can see. But it is wonderful to have her here today. So the format we're going to have is we'll have a little bit of a discussion at the beginning. So Isobel's going to lead just on who GiveDirectly are, what they do. I've got a couple of questions that I'll start off with to get things going, and then we'll go into Q&A until 1 o'clock. And then after that, if you would all be very welcome to join us for lunch afterwards in the foyer.
Okay.
So I'll hand over to Isobel to kick off.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And what a fabulous building. So thank you for welcoming me here. Can I just ask before we start, how many of you have actually heard of GiveDirectly before? Okay, so a fair number. I always like to say to my friends, it's the biggest nonprofit you've never heard of, because outside of, this is, we have an RCT going on here, so it's not surprising to me that many of you have heard of it. But the concept of unconditional cash transfers is still quite radical in many places. I talk all the time to philanthropists who, they look at me quite quizzically and they say, you just give them cash, that's it. You don't train them, you don't make them, there's no conditionality, they don't have to do anything for it. And we say, yeah, we just give them cash. And people find that really, really radical. But it's in response to a simple question, which is, can the poor do more for themselves than we can do on their behalf? And now, thanks to randomized control trials, more than 200 of them, not that we've done them all, we've done or are doing 13 of them, but across the world, there have been more than 200 robust studies done on cash, and they all say generally the same thing, that very poor people know actually how to use money well to meet their own needs. And you see gains sustained over some time in assets, income, and consumption. And so it's a very effective way to address extreme poverty by empowering people to help themselves. And I've spent a fair amount of time out in the field over the last couple of years talking with recipients of our cash transfers, and the breadth of what they do with it is tremendous. You just can't predict what people need and what they want. And when you give them the option of deciding for themselves, they make a wide range of choices. And so we really see that self-driven optimization on a daily basis. So that's how we end up working in this space. And I would just add that I think some of the most interesting work going on at GiveDirectly, but also in global development today, is the cash benchmarking work that we're doing with the support of USAID, which is the U.S. Development Agency. And economists at USAID have bought into this question: can the poor do more for themselves than we can do on their behalf? And USAID programming, not surprisingly, is very expensive. And so the idea of actually taking at least a part of that big budget and delivering it directly to people, which we do via mobile phones, and seeing what the results are, is intriguing to USAID. And we're doing 6 benchmarking studies right now across 4 different countries. And the first one came out, it was a nutrition study. It benchmarked a traditional nutrition program. One of the big challenges in doing a benchmark like that is coming up with what is the per capita cost for the traditional intervention. And I think it took USAID more than a year to figure that out, to really add in all the costs that are generated by developing that program. And then they came up with a range of what they thought it might be, and we delivered an amount of cash in that range, and it worked out to about $110 per household over the course of a year. So very, very small. I mean, this is in Rwanda, and in Rwanda you have household sizes, 4 to 5 people. And so $110 over 12 months is a very small amount of money. And we said, to benchmark, we'll provide that equivalent amount of cash, but we'd also like to do a larger amount of cash as a third arm of the RCT, because we didn't think that that small amount of cash would move the needle on nutrition metrics, and that's what USAID was really interested in, because the money came out of their nutrition budget. And so after, when the results came out, the traditional nutrition program, it did have a savings component, and the results were that it did not move the needle on the nutrition metrics, and they were 5 specific nutrition metrics: height for age, weight for age, mother-child, anemia levels, dietary diversity in the household, and one other, which I'm forgetting right now. And they saw no progress on that. They did see increases in savings, and there was a savings component to that traditional program. In the work that we did in our cash transfer, we also saw no improvements in the nutrition metrics, but we did see gains in assets, income, consumption. And we saw not an increase in savings, but a significant decrease in debt. And then in the third arm, which was the larger amount of cash, we saw significant nutrition improvements. And so, people could step back and say, well, you spent more money per capita on that larger cash piece. And yes, we did. It was about $530. So it was significantly more money. But if your goal is to move the needle on nutrition, the traditional nutrition program doesn't seem to be doing that. And so is there a different amount of money someplace in between the 110 and the 530 that could be a sweet spot? Maybe. I think our hypothesis is that it's probably closer to the 500 than it is to the 100. But it does call into question the efficacy of those much bigger nutrition budgets if the goal is to move the needle on nutrition. And I'd just say one last thing. When you give people the choice, they very rationally pay down debt, which is very expensive. When you can save at 0 or perhaps negative real interest rates, or you can pay down debt, which can be very expensive. When you give them that choice, that's what they do. So that's some of the work we're doing. And I'll just make one last comment. We do large cash transfers. In some of our programs, it's as much as $1,000. In the Rwanda study, it was $530. But we also do small amounts of cash, too. So we've tested a lot of different things. We have the largest basic income program underway right now in Kenya. And that project has 3 different arms. One arm is a monthly stipend tied to the minimum expenditure basket of $22.50 a month for 2 years. Another arm is that same amount for 12 years. And a third arm is a $500 lump sum upfront transfer that is sort of a roll-up of that 2 years worth of payments. And we will have our first results from that project sometime later in 2020.
So I think some people are not familiar with the operational model. Could you just give an idea of how it works? Just tell us a bit about, GiveDirectly goes into a village. How does this cash program work?
So it starts with raising money, and we get money from a number of different sources. About, a little more about 60% of our money is just from retail donors, people who read about us and come on our website and make a donation or send us a check, wire us money. I mean, we get sometimes some quite large donations from people we've never heard of or never seen before who just read about us. The recent research that just came out on general equilibrium has been reported widely in the press, in The Economist and the Washington Post and Vox and the Financial Times, all sorts of places. And people read about it and they say, oh, yeah, I get that. This is a radical but really clear and simple idea, and I understand why giving money directly makes so much sense. So it starts with raising money. The other 40% we're now raising from institutional investors, and that's why I mention that, because from there on out, then the process is a little different. With the retail money, we can really do whatever we want with it, and we work in the poorest countries, and we try to work with the poorest people in the poorest countries, and we can just sort of roll out a program of delivering cash. We have country offices led by a field staff who will go into a village and first identify the area of the country that we want to work in, then using all sorts of data, identify the region that we want to work in, and then go and actually meet with people in the village. The first thing that happens is a baratza. You bring everybody together and explain to people what we're going to do and why we're doing it. People are sometimes shocked and surprised, but then sometimes they're suspicious. And there's a process of really bringing everybody along and making sure that everybody understands, and that and there's a teaching element to this, of really teaching people that we're going to deliver them cash on their phone. We then offer to give them a phone, which will come out of the transfer. We buy the phones in bulk at very low cost. They're just like old flip phone type phones from, we get them in Dubai, and they cost about $8 or so, and that cost will come out of their transfer. And most of the people ask to purchase a phone because it's such a good cost for them. They may already have one, but many of them do not. And then there's an element of training them on security, to make sure that they're going to get a passcode on how to use the phone and how to cash out the money. And nobody from GiveDirectly should ever know their code. Nobody in their village should ever know their code. We work with the village leaders who stand up there with us and say, don't tell your code to anybody. So, everybody's on the same page. And then there's a whole process of really ensuring identity along the way. People get a unique number, a unique code. Then the cash is delivered. We have a follow-up team that will come and ask questions. We have a call center where we do outbound calling to make sure that people receive their money, that they've had no problems cashing it out. We spent a lot of time thinking about liquidity. We can come back to that if people have questions on it. We work in very remote areas that are far away from markets, and how do you, once you've got this money on your phone, how do people then cash it out and buy something with it? So we do spend a lot of time and attention thinking about that. And I think the short answer on that is people have poo-pooed us all along the way. You cannot do this. You cannot deliver cash in Liberia. It won't work. There's no connectivity. There's no liquidity, da-da-da. We do it. And we do it with ease, frankly. And so I think we've proven the model under very challenging circumstances. And then we do some follow-up, and if it's part of a randomized control trial, about half of our work today is randomized control trial, about half of it is not. If it is, then there's follow-up that happens that may be different from our standard programming. I mention the institutional funding because a lot of times they have very specific things that they're trying to achieve, and so the process would be different on figuring out who is going to get the cash and how much it's going to be and all sorts of things. We're doing, right now, we've just launched this year a very innovative program with UNICEF in Kampala, where we're providing cash transfers to schoolgirls, to their guardians actually, because these are girls who are roughly 13, 14 years old. They're in primary 5 and they're making the transition to secondary school, and you see very high dropout rates for girls at that moment. And it's a moment for a variety of reasons that the dropout rates spike, one of which is that school fees also double. And families who are very poor and are looking at, getting my daughter now through secondary school, recognizing that school fees are going to double, plus a whole bunch of other challenges, they tend to drop out. And so this program is in conjunction with the Kampala city government, and UNICEF is funding it, but it's really been designed by both of them, and we are implementing the cash piece of it. So it's quite a different model from what I just described.
So, even during the period that GiveDirectly was founded and has started to grow, the growth in social protection schemes, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, has been huge. So, it was just for your talk, looking up, The Economist ran a leader in February, and they noted that sub-Saharan African countries are now spending 1.2% of GDP on social protection programs. Developed countries spend 1.6%. So there's a huge number of these, but often targeted small grant programs running throughout Africa. So what do you think GiveDirectly can say to governments about how one thinks about designing cash programs? Yeah. You've now got a range of RCTs. What do you think we can say? What do you think we still have to learn?
It's a great question. I think we have a lot to say on the operational side, a lot. A lot of times governments are implementing these programs by literally carrying bags of cash around. And that's extraordinarily expensive. They're loading bags of cash into a truck and driving it out to villages and literally handing wads of bills out to people. That is rife with leakage and with delays and problems and cost, enormous cost. So what we have done, I think, is shown what best looks like from an operational efficiency perspective, so that I hope presents a model for what governments hopefully eventually should be able to achieve. So it's doable. We're not working at the scale that governments are working at, but the model is there, and they should be able to achieve that. And when they're working at scale, they should be much more efficient than even we are. So there's huge operational learnings. I think from the programmatic design, many of these government programs are delivering very small amounts of cash. So, we have been looking at 2 social protection programs, one in Liberia, one in Malawi. In Liberia, from an operational sense, the World Bank has made a loan to the Liberian government to develop a project demonstrating a social protection program, and they've spent a couple of years now and have yet to really get off the ground. So we have been engaging with them from an operational sense to sort of show what we're doing and maybe what they could be doing. They just did a small pilot of the pilot and delivered physical cash. So at enormous expense, it's just not scalable in any cost-effective way. In Malawi, they're also delivering physical cash. They've had a program in place for some years. It's a small amount of money. It's about $8 to $10. And in Malawi, they've been disappointed that they've not seen the reductions in malnutrition that they'd hoped for from this social protection program. There are very high rates of malnutrition in Malawi. And so if you're giving families cash, you'd expect to see a reduction in that malnutrition. But from the cash benchmarking work I just noted earlier, we did a project in Rwanda where we delivered roughly $8 to $10 a month for a household and an RCT, and we saw no reductions in those nutrition metrics at that small amount of money. At a larger amount of money, we saw huge reductions in malnutrition. So I think what we can say is, depending on what your goal is, if it's truly to reduce malnutrition, you got to have a bigger monthly transfer. The size has to be bigger. That's politically challenging because you've got limited budgets and how do you deploy them? But I would also say that if you have limited budgets and you're going to disperse a small amount of money across a lot of people and have no impact on what you're trying to achieve, that's also a waste of money. So figuring that out is, I think, a really huge policy challenge. And we have proposed to try to replicate the cash benchmark, testing a couple of different amounts. It could be lower than the 500 that we tested. I don't know how much lower, but we should test some different amounts and see if we can zero in on an optimal number that can really move the needle on nutrition metrics, among other things.
So I saw you've just again been rated by GiveWell as one of its top charities. So GiveWell is an organization that aggregates evidence on the efficacy of poverty reduction programs and recommends a set of charities as being, particularly highly cost effective. It's striking there that all of the other charities chosen for this year are in very basic health. So, they're malaria nets, malaria prevention, deworming, that sort of thing. How do you think about, GiveDirectly being placed in contrast to those programs? So what, when individual donors see those two very different kinds of programs next to each other, how should they think? How should governments think? Do you think of them as substitutes? Are they complements? How do they kind of go together?
Well, I think of them as complements. We know cash is multi-purpose, and we know that people are spending a portion of their cash transfers on health. We know that. And everybody has different health needs. Some may be using it to purchase some very critical but low-cost insurance. Others are paying hospital bill for that's been hanging over them and that have put them in debt. Others use it to, fix something that they've been living with. They've lost eyesight or a broken arm or something where they can't work. And, people have very different needs. So to just have one intervention that deals with one health issue may be suboptimal when you're dealing with a broad and diverse set of needs. But we recognize that health is definitely a component of what we do. And today, we're talking now with lots of different partners about doing really cash plus, a model where, maybe it's an organization that's delivering a health intervention, and they recognize that one of the barriers for them for success is that, even if you build it, they sometimes don't come because they don't have the small amount of cash to get there, or the small amount of cash to buy the medicine every month, or whatever it may be. And health and poverty are highly related, highly correlated. And so cash, I see multi-purpose cash as being very complementary to health. And as we talk with institutional donors, there are big buckets of money that are specifically for health. And I think many in the institutional space that have spent years trying to address HIV, for example, recognize that the money that they're spending is very expensive per capita, tied specifically to this HIV, getting loads down, and people with some unrestricted cash may have much better outcomes. And so figuring out how to marry interventions together, I think, has enormous potential.
Because I think some of the challenge that's often brought up, when I was teaching in this lecture theatre, the sort of health work on externalities. So some of the issue with deworming is that people don't price in that what they purchase for their own child has benefits for other people. So do you see the sort of cash plus interventions as helping people to cost in those sorts of externalities?
It's, costing in externalities is really hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to do. The general equilibrium study that has just come out is an attempt to look at the benefits, not just for recipients who receive the cash, but I think it's the first really big study that's tried to look at the impact for the whole community and for non-recipients. And, that's a very ambitious study, and it was very elegant in its design in many ways, but it took a long time and is expensive. All of these RCTs, you have to remember, are time-consuming and expensive. You know this very well. I think Kate probably has scars on your back from it, but trying to account for some of those externalities, I think, would help people understand better, but it is challenging to do.
So I'm hearing you say, both for health and for anywhere else in aid, we should be costing in the effects that the program has by spilling over to other people, and we should be doing the thing that's the most cost effective. So in health, there may be some things like deworming that are super high value, but there may also be other things where it may make more sense just to give people the money directly. And we've got to do that.
And we have to do that. I recognize it's not easy to do. Again, time-consuming, takes a long time, money. But if it really does begin to narrow down the types of interventions that we should be doing to really move the needle on the goals of improving life generally for people.
So one of the questions that's come up as these programs sort of roll through a particular part of the country is, we know these are markets that may not function super well. Is it possible that if you put a lot of cash into a community at once, that you get inflation? So what lessons has GiveDirectly learned recently about that? Is that something that we should be worried about? On the other hand, Keynes told us, well, if you put a lot of money into an economy, sometimes you get a multiplier effect. So people who have the money spend with shopkeepers, that has kind of knock-on benefits. So I know you've learned some interesting things recently.
Yeah, well, we've worried about this question. There's been some noise around the inflation issue. If you are delivering cash transfers to some but not to others, are the others worse off? Are prices going up and they're left having to pay more and they didn't get the cash transfer? So are you making some people worse? This was something that worried us. And in early days of GiveDirectly, we had a targeting methodology where we would go into villages and identify, even in these very poor villages, who are the poorest in these villages by those that had a thatch roof versus a tin roof. Oh, well, if you've got a thatch roof, you're definitely the poorest. But we moved away from that quite quickly, concerned that maybe that some who are almost as poor are going to be left worse off. And so we try now to do more of a saturation model where everybody in the village is getting the cash. But this new paper that's come out, this general equilibrium paper, has looked really it did a remarkable job of collecting price data over a pretty large geographic area over 27 months and did many, many, many data points. And the inflation was never more than 1%, even at the peak. And the program delivered at its peak 17% of that geographic area's GDP. And it was a bottom-up analysis to figure out what the GDP of that area was, and again, took a lot of time and effort. And even at that level, they really saw very little, negligible inflation at that peak, that less than 1%, it sort of averaged 0.1%, I mean, over the course. So you'd see little price spikes and then it would come down again quite quickly. So I think, and the multiplier effect was calculated at 2.6. So for every $1,000 invested, you got over that time period, that 27 months, you got $2,600 worth of value in that local economy. And I think one of the key takeaways is that much of the money was spent locally, like within a 2-kilometer area. So that Keynes was right in this respect. Now, I think when markets are now the area that this was in Kenya, you know, there's a road, not an insignificant road that runs right along the edge of this geographic area from the coast to Lake Victoria. It's not, it's rural. These are villages that are walking distance from marketplaces of at most a couple of hours. There was a study that looked at, in the Philippines, that looked at cash being delivered in a much more remote area, and you did see inflation. So I think you have to be cognizant of how distant you are from markets, and in a humanitarian post-disaster situation, be cognizant of, you know, how quickly markets are returning to functionality. In Mozambique, after Hurricane Idai, there was a lot of concern. Cash programming makes a lot of sense in the humanitarian space. How quickly would markets recover? And it was very quickly. So I think what we're discovering in our globalized world today is that markets actually do recover very quickly.
And, you know, potentially then some of the positive maybe that you're injecting money into a post-conflict situation that
and helping it quickly restart. Yeah.
And so I wondered from, you know, having really seen this from the inside, so we've been working with GiveDirectly for a couple of years on a randomized control trial, and there's often very difficult trade-offs that the organization has to face between what's operationally most efficient and achieving this sort of set of research studies that you guys have decided that you wanted to execute. And so I wondered, you know, what's your sense of how did research become such an important part of GiveDirectly's mission? Do you think that that's something that what interesting lessons have you seen in that trade-off process? And do you think that that's an important direction for NGOs to be going in?
Well, research was critical to GiveDirectly's founding and growth, because I hark back to what I started with saying, is that when you describe to most people, just give people cash, they look at you like you're crazy. And so I think you need research to be compelling and convincing. I mean, for me, it's so obvious, and it's not just obvious from an economic perspective, but also from a dignity perspective, from an empowerment perspective, from an efficiency perspective. I mean, on so many different levels. Let the poor decide for themselves, because who are we sitting in New York or Washington or London to know what poor people really need? And I'm always amazed when I visit villages and I ask people, what did you do with the money? And not only do they have so many different things, but they're so astute in how they purchase. You know, I didn't go to that market because they were going to charge me more. I walked 2 hours to go to this market because I know I can get a better price. I've always wanted to own a cow. I could have bought a cow for $400, but I bought the more drought-resistant cow for $600 because I've seen the rains changing. I mean, they're all over this stuff in a way that we never would be. So research, I think, is important to help build the case for broader structural change. And I go back to the cash benchmarking work that we're doing with USAID, and I underscore, I truly think it's the most innovative thing going on in global development today. I give huge kudos to USAID for undertaking it and driving sectoral change that will really eventually drive much more resources to more effective interventions. I mean, that's the whole point. It's not to replace everything that's done in the world with cash. That's not the purpose. It's to say, does this intervention beat the cash benchmark? And when it does, great. Do that all day long, you know. And if it doesn't beat the cash benchmark, then don't do it. Just simply give people the cash. Or tweak it so that it does beat the cash benchmark. I mean, the goal is to beat the cash benchmark. That should be the goal. If you can do more for the poor than they can do for themselves, then go ahead and do it. But I'd like to see those programs. And in the meantime, holding that bar, I think, is incredibly important. Establishing it and holding it is very important. So research is central. That said, I don't think research is, the goal in and of itself. And you have to be able to take research results and extrapolate from them. And I've heard donors say, well, that RCT in Rwanda, it might not apply in Kenya, it might not apply in another country. So we can't really change anything based on one study and one result. That's okay, I take that. But at what point does the evidence base, you have to say enough, like we've now got 200 randomized controlled trials on cash or more. Show me another intervention that has that many RCTs that are all saying the same thing. So I think it shouldn't become a barrier and an excuse. Oh, well, we can't change until we have one more study.
Fantastic. So I think now we'll open up for questions. So we have roving microphones, I believe. So just stick your hand up if you have a question. The reason for that is it's being live streamed, so the people outside the room can't hear you.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much for your presentation. My question goes very much related to what you just talked about. So regarding external validity, and then also, I had heard before about GiveDirectly, and I read about the general equilibrium paper that came out some weeks ago. And kudos for making this paper visible, making this research, like I read in the Washington Post. So I think that this is great that actually research gets through and goes out of the journals and actually people can read it. But my question was rather regarding so what is the sustainability of this project? So like, regarding both the long term, so you talked about a project that would be 12 years. Would this GiveDirectly be working like farther than that, let's say with the same family for 25 years, a whole lifespan? And then also, I'm also interested about the general equilibrium once you would scale up such a project as GiveDirectly. So instead of giving one family in the community this money, what would happen if instead of one family, you give it to the whole community?
Okay, so multiple different questions in there. Just on the last question, we don't give to just one family in a community. We typically give to everybody in the community. So we saturate the whole community. And in the study that was just done, the general equilibrium study, there were villages that got the cash and villages that didn't get the cash. So it was divided that way, not within villages.
More because what you said, like the countries want to do this project themselves, so then they would have to scale up and do it.
Yeah.
Like the ultimate.
So that scale up question is a really important one. I think as Kate mentioned, countries are already spending 1.2% of GDP. As GDP grows, they'll have more money to spend on that, and figuring out what is the amount. I know politically you want to be able to deliver the cash to as many people as possible, but that may not be the right approach if you want to get the most bang for your buck. It may be better to deliver cash to fewer number of people in a more concentrated way with a very clear rationale that you can articulate. So it may be, we're going to hit those areas that have the highest rates of malnutrition, because malnutrition in the first 1,000 days of life stays with you for your entire lifetime in terms of reduced abilities, income, earnings, everything. And so the value, the ROI of really addressing malnutrition in those first 1,000 days you could make, I think, a rational political case for why we're going to concentrate our resources in that way. Not that it would be politically without challenges, but those types of questions are going to be major policy considerations. We are doing a lot of work with refugees now, and in the refugee world, there are multiple different sources of assistance that are delivered on a monthly basis. Some of it is in kind, and increasingly some of it is cash, but it's really tied to that minimum expenditure basket. So it keeps families alive, but doesn't allow them to thrive. And the reality in the refugee space today is that these are not temporary situations. They are not people who are displaced for a couple of months and go home. That's not the norm. The norm is now people are displaced for 10 years. And when you're displaced for multiple years like that, there are enormous benefits to integrating these displaced people into the community. And this monthly dripped aid really doesn't allow for that. And the roles of people that UNHCR and others are having to support keeps growing, and they keep delivering a small amount of money. What if you could roll up a year's worth of payment and deliver it as a lump sum? Would they actually be able at that point to buy an asset that could generate income and make them more self-sufficient? So in northern Uganda, in the Kirindongo settlement, we're doing a 10,000 household RCT trying to answer that exact question. And UNHCR is our partner in that, and they're looking at it very carefully because they recognize that even though it seems more expensive, that maybe over time some of these approaches could actually save money and provide a much better life for people.
Hello. Yeah, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that the first choice people often make is to pay down debt. The kind of debt providers around, is there any analysis of who they might be? And is there any impact on the fact that there's now more money available in these communities? And are these guys following you around?
Yeah, debt can be in many different forms. Debt can be among family members. It can also be more formalized, a money lender. So it can take many different forms. We know debt can be very expensive. You know, people are charging pretty high rates of interest. It's one of the things that people do is that they pay down debt. It's certainly not the only thing that they do, and not everybody has debt. So we did see reductions in debt among some people who had debt, but not everybody even has access to credit. So, you know, I can't say everybody's paying down debt. What we do see is that on average, about anywhere from 2/3 to 75% of the money is invested, and 1/3 to 25% is consumed. And we see that pretty generally across all of our work, and it came up in the general equilibrium study too. And people are investing it in their homes, they're investing it in businesses, they're investing it in education. They're buying different types of assets that will generate income. And the consumption is largely in the form of food. And they're increasing their caloric intake and the quality of their caloric intake. See that.
Thank you very much for your insights and experiences. I want to ask, if you would be president of the US, would you implement any big cash policies, or do you think it's like, is there enough research to advocate that for, like, on a large scale in the US?
I think that I'm a skeptic of a universal basic income program in the U.S. Because of the universal piece of it. I understand people think that the universality of it would help politically make it more palatable, but I think it would be an expensive way to channel resources to those who need it most. In the US, there are, contrary to what is reported, there actually are many different social protection programs in place already. Some are in kind and some are cash. And I think a program that consolidated all of that and managed it in a more simplified way and delivered and got rid of the in-kind and delivered it all as cash would be a more cost-effective program. And I would be pro that.
So the communities that you target have one thing in common, and that being that they're all very poor. How closely do you observe differences in the way different communities within the same country and in other countries use the cash that's given to them?
We observe it pretty closely because we do a lot of follow-up and we ask people what they're doing with the money. And so the specific types of things they do may be different. But in general, we work in poor rural areas where people are generally engaged in subsistence farming. And we generally see that sort of 1/4, 3/4 split between consumption and investment. And it generally follows pretty similar patterns. A lot of the money is invested in people improve their homes. They do that wherever we work. We see that. And I mentioned that one of the early targeting methods was a thatch roof versus a tin roof. And interestingly, what did people do when they got the money? They immediately replaced their thatch roof with a tin roof. And that's interesting. How many programs are there out there to deliver a tin roof, right? And that is apparently what people want the most. Well, why? That's a good question, thatch roofs leak. And you end up with mud on your floor, and it has negative health implications, and their food spoils, and you get bugs in the thatched. And the thatched has to be replaced every 18 months, and that's expensive. And so some smart person calculated that the ROI on the tin roof was 18%. That's a pretty good investment. So, again, people are savvy and they know what to do with it. So we do see pretty consistently people investing in homes and people investing in livestock. We do see a lot of that. But then what kind of livestock will vary on their interests, skills, abilities, where they are. We did a program in Mathare, in a slum in Nairobi. And we saw people investing in small businesses, a lot of sort of informal businesses that they'd already had, women who were cooking food for sale for lunch. They would buy bigger pots so they could cook more food. They would buy another burner. We saw a number of the recipients become Airtel money agents, mobile money agents. We're seeing more of that. People do all different things, but in Mathare, one of the things we also saw is they sent money back to their rural village to buy livestock. So, diversification. They're actually very smart. They know to diversify.
I had two quick questions. My first was, you talked a little bit about the work you're doing is helping build the case for broader structural change. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit more about your big picture vision, what you'd like to see in the future for this kind of work. Who's giving money to who and where and on what scale. And then my second was if you have any research or thoughts on the gender implications in your work and giving money to men versus women and how you're doing that, and if you see folks spending money in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you. So the World Bank did a report where they looked at the amount of money spent on youth development and youth training programs, which was $9 billion. Kate is shaking her head knowingly, and showed that there was really almost zero impact from that. Is that fair? That's a whole lot of money. So my vision, my dream, would be that we're not doing that. We're not wasting $9 billion on training programs and nutrition programs and things that keep a lot of people employed, that pays a lot of consultants and travel and overhead and costs and everything, but that you can actually put that money directly into people's hands and that allow them to use it in ways that are going to most effectively address their needs. And $9 billion is a lot of money. And there are many, the Brookings Institute did an analysis that looked at how much money is spent on global development today. And I think it was $160 billion. And how much would it cost if we did a cash transfer based on our efficiency metrics to bring everybody up to that minimum of $2 a day? And it was about 80 billion. So we have the money that is being spent. It's just not necessarily being spent in the most effective ways. And so my dream would be that we're spending that money in ways that really move the needle, and the world would be a better place. On the gender issue, we have not seen huge gender differences in impact between men and women. I mean, men and women do make different choices, but they're investing roughly the same amount and consuming roughly the same amount. And when we deliver money to a household, we will enroll as the recipient, the person who is there on the day that we come. And in general, over all of our work, the majority of our recipients have been women. So roughly 60+% have been women. And we've done some programs that are specifically focused on women. I mentioned the program we're doing with UNICEF at schoolgirls, not boys. But when we do our general work, we'll give to men and women, and we see very similar outcomes for both.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm a social policy student and I'm researching the Global South as well, especially Sub-Saharan Africa. And I have two questions. So the first one is in terms of the policy-making process, when you do enter these countries or these communities, who are the policymakers or the stakeholders that you communicate with outside of the villagers themselves or the people living in these communities themselves? And then in terms of the role, you alluded a little bit in the beginning about the people that actually give the money to GiveDirectly. So what role does big philanthropy play in actually the effectiveness that we see of these programs?
So on the first question, when we enter a country, we have to register, and that can take a while to get registered with all the paperwork and everything else, but it's really just registering as an NGO, as a nonprofit. And then after that, we often just sort of fly under the radar. But more and more, we're engaging with policymakers on the social protection issues and what we're doing and how it can feed back into what they're doing and how they think about their programming. And that, I think, is a space that we should really invest more time and effort in, because it's a way to leverage our work and scale it, if not us directly, having governments scale it. I mean, part of my vision would be that governments are implementing highly efficient, effective social protection programs that are meeting the needs of the poorest people in their populations. And that we are helping show the way on operationally what best in class looks like, and also programmatically we're able to iterate and innovate in ways that maybe a government-run program just doesn't have the bandwidth to do. So I think that's a really important role.
Thank you. Subject is, of course, what role can big cash policy play in policy? And thinking particularly of government policy, I'm wondering if you found that there tends to be a different response from developing country governments to conditional cash transfers as opposed to unconditional. And I'm asking the question also in particular because as a journalist back about 13, 14 years ago, I went to what described itself as the world's first unconditional cash transfer scheme. Not sure whether it was, but that's what they said. It was called BIG in Namibia, Basic Income Grant. It was being trialled at that point among several thousand people, 6,000 to 10,000 people, I believe it was, in a generally poor area. An unconditional scheme, the money given to absolutely everybody in the community. Thoroughly unscientifically, as a journalist, the evidence seemed to be that it was pretty effective, that it seemed to be having some effect in particular on health and on school attendance and enrollment. Some people were spending it on their houses and so on, but everybody involved seemed to feel the money was being used well. It was likely to be a very effective scheme. The idea of those who were behind it, which was essentially the Lutherans and various Lutheran agencies funding it for several months, was that the government would take it up and that it would perhaps be paid for out of general taxation, maybe a rise in general taxation. It was, however, not long before a general election. And my recollection is that the government didn't take it up. And it was believed, not least because they felt it wouldn't be a very good election strategy, because it would mean likely a rise in taxes. I don't know whether you know, I've lost track of what happened today. I don't know whether you know about that scheme, about whether that has been taken any further in that particular country. And again, whether there's any distinction generally in government's responses to making them unconditional rather than conditional.
I'm not familiar with that particular program, and the fact that I'm not familiar with it makes me think it hasn't gone on, because I've looked at many different ones, and that's pretty interesting, but I just don't know. It could be. You know, it's governments have their own ideas of how they want to spend money and how they want to deliver anti-poverty programs. And I had an opportunity to talk with some of the architects of the big Bolsa Familia program in Brazil, which is a conditional cash program. And it's very interesting because we got into a long conversation about conditionality, and there has been a fair amount of research that the conditionality doesn't really work. It doesn't pay. And the architects of the program said, well, yeah, we never really intended for the conditionality to work. If you unpack it, the conditions we imposed, sending your kids to school, getting them vaccinated, there were already very high rates of compliance. But we could never have gotten these programs through our parliament politically if it didn't have conditions attached to it. So that's the world we live in. I think conditionality can be expensive. It can cause unintended consequences. You know, you may be giving cash to people and the condition is that they send their kids to school and the schooling is so bad or non-existent that it's actually counterproductive. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can happen when you attach conditionality. But bottom line is that it's typically more expensive than the benefit that you get from it. Which is how, you know, in my own personal progression, I started out as a writing from an academic perspective about microfinance and became disillusioned about microfinance for a variety of reasons, moved on to conditional cash transfers. And while conditional cash transfers have had enormous impact and success, really questioning the conditionality and moved to unconditional cash transfers. It's sort of a natural, logical, intellectual progression for me. And I think that's where much of the world will get to, but it's not an easy place for policymakers to get to for political reasons. And it comes back to the data, you know, the research that we do. If you can continue to show that, in fact, the outcomes are really, really good, then I think it will help people make that leap. And, you know, have been talking with one country outside of Africa about a social protection program, and the government has been very wedded to workfare. Now, Kate is nodding vigorously because she knows that workfare may be sort of the worst of the worst in terms of grossly inefficient programs. You make people work in return for a day's wage. But the projects are often very expensive to implement and manage and often counterproductive. Build a road that then gets washed out. Build a bridge to nowhere that then can't support any weight and collapses. I mean, quality issues. And these are poor people who a day's work is away from something that they most desperately need to be doing. But this is the national government, the multi-development bank that is lending to the government keeps saying, please do unconditional cash transfer, please. And the government says, no, 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 our people will just waste it. We're going to do workfare. So it's a process that I think will take a long time.
One other, so some countries start with a targeting criterion. So we'll target food poor areas, or we'll target orphans and vulnerable children to begin with, or old people, or people with children. So it does seem then that it often broadens out once that program has been successful. It's a possibility to broaden it out to other groups. But it does definitely seem like getting the political traction is a difficult beginning. I think that's all we've got time for today. So if there are any final things that you wanted to close off with?
Somebody asked a question about big philanthropy, and I didn't answer that part of it. I'm sorry, we got sidetracked. But I would just say that we have really benefited from people watching what we do, being believers in what we do, and providing us with the resources to do it in a very efficient way and to innovate. And innovation is less efficient. You know, it's costly to do these RCTs and everything else. And the part of GiveDirectly that is research-based and very innovative, I think, is hugely important. But the other part where we just say, okay, we know the evidence, we're just going to go out and do it, allows us to reach, more than now 200. We've delivered. Well, we've raised $250 million and delivered it to almost 200,000 households in the countries that we work in. So it's not at scale, but it's pointing a direction for people who are interested in really highly effective altruism to achieve scale. So thank you all.
And thank you so much from all of us for coming. And so please don't forget that the sandwiches in the lobby are labeled for you. They are not conditional. They are just food, apparently, otherwise people forget to have them. So please, if you would join.